There is a town in the middle of Pennsylvania where people use their own currency, follow their own calendar, and decide among themselves who is allowed to own a car. It is not a reservation. It is not a commune. It is not a gated community. It is, on paper, an ordinary American town with a zip code, a post office, and a spot on the map. But the moment you cross its border, the United States you thought you lived in quietly steps aside and a different country takes over. No sign tells you that. No fence marks it. You just feel it. The air changes. The rules change. And if you stay long enough, you start to understand that the flag overhead is the only thing you still share with the people living there. This is Report State, and today we are going somewhere most Americans do not know exists. Not a foreign country, not a disputed territory. 10 towns inside the borders of the United States that function like separate nations. Some of them have their own police. Some of them have their own economies. One of them has a mayor who counts the entire population on 2 hands. One of them had its last real election when Richard Nixon was still in office. And one of them sits on a state line so strange that the law on one side of your kitchen does not apply on the other side of your kitchen. Before we start, understand this. The America you see on television is a country of 50 states, 1 flag, 1 constitution, and 1 set of rules. The America you see on the ground is something much stranger. It is 50 states, 1 flag, 1 constitution, and about 1,000 quiet exceptions. Most of those exceptions are small: a zoning quirk, a tax loophole, a weird local ordinance about chickens. But some of them are enormous. Whole towns where the people who live there have, in practice, opted out of the country the rest of us are stuck with. They did it legally, they did it quietly, and most of your neighbors have no idea these places exist. We are going to walk through 10 of them. From the Amish farmland of Pennsylvania to a Russian Old Believer village on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. From a libertarian experiment in New Hampshire that turned into a bear problem, to a polygamist compound that swallowed the Utah-Arizona border and refused to give it back for 70 years. We will end on the strangest one of all, a town where 2 states share the same street and the same house and the same family, but not the same law. You think you know how America works. You don't. Not until you've seen these 10. One more thing before we begin. My name is Report State, and I have been walking into places like this for a long time. I have stood in the parking lots of towns where a stranger with a camera is a problem. I have talked to people who answered my questions by quoting a book I had never read. I have watched a county sheriff pretend not to notice something that would have ended a career in any other county. I'm not here to mock these towns. I'm not here to praise them either. I am here to show you, very plainly, what they are, and to ask you a question at the end. A question you will not want to answer out loud. If you make it to the end of this video, subscribe. Not because I am asking you to, because the next time you drive through a small American town and something feels off, you are going to want to know why. You are going to want to know which version of the country you just walked into. Let's break it down. Number 10. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The buggies and the bank. Lancaster County is the one most Americans have at least heard of. Rolling green farmland in south-central Pennsylvania, about 70 miles west of Philadelphia. 2-lane roads with buggy lanes painted on them. Laundry on the line. Beards without mustaches. Women in bonnets. Tourist shops selling pretzel mix and handmade quilts. If you drove through it on a Sunday, you would call it charming. You would be wrong. Charming is the souvenir version. The real Lancaster County, the inner part, the Old Order Amish and Old Order Mennonite districts, is something Americans do not have a category for anymore. Here is what nobody tells you. Lancaster County is home to roughly 40,000 Old Order Amish. That is the largest Amish settlement in the world. bigger than anywhere in Ohio, bigger than anywhere in Indiana. And the old order Amish do not operate like an American subculture. They operate like a functioning parallel society that happens to share our zip codes. They do not vote in practice. They do not serve in the military. They do not use the public school system past 8th grade. They do not pay into Social Security thanks to an exemption written into federal law in 1965. They do not carry health insurance in the normal sense. They do not drive, although they hire English drivers, which is what they call the rest of us, for longer trips. And the bishops who run each church district hold more day-to-day authority over the lives of their members than the county commissioner does. You think I'm exaggerating? Let me give you the numbers. Around 90% of old order Amish teenagers, after a period called Rumspringa, where they are allowed to see the outside world, choose to return and be baptized into the church. 90%. There is no other closed community in the United States with a retention rate like that. Harvard does not retain its alumni that well. The Marines do not retain their veterans that well. The American middle class does not retain its children that well. In a country where every other subculture is leaking members to the internet, Lancaster County is not leaking. A neighbor of mine, a man named Harold Keller, grew up on a farm that shared a fence with an old order Amish family in Leacock Township. He told me something I have never forgotten. He said, quote, "Zero, that is the part tourists miss. The Amish are not a museum. They are a well-capitalized agricultural society operating inside the most expensive farmland market in the eastern United States. And they are winning. Land prices in Lancaster County have been pushed to extraordinary levels, in part because the Amish buy farms from each other at rates no outsider can match. And they do it without mortgages in the conventional sense. They pool money through the church. 9 families will fund a 10th family's land purchase, and the paperwork looks nothing like a bank loan. Picture this. It is a Tuesday morning in October. You take a back road out of the town of Intercourse, Pennsylvania, and within 10 minutes you have lost cell service. Not because there is no tower, because the phone companies never bothered to build one in a place full of people who do not carry phones. You pass a one-room schoolhouse. The children inside will finish their education at 14. You pass a farmhouse with no power lines running to it. A kerosene lamp is visible in the window. You pass a roadside stand with a hand-lettered sign that reads, "Eggs, $2, honor system." You put $2 in a tin can and you take a dozen eggs. Nobody watches you. Nobody needs to. And you realize, slowly, that the rules of this place are not being enforced by the state of Pennsylvania. They are being enforced by something older, something more effective, something you have no access to. So yes, Lancaster County is on the map. Lancaster County is in the United States. Lancaster County has a Walmart. But the core of Lancaster County, the part that gives it its character, operates under a set of rules the rest of us do not touch. It is the softest version of what we are going to see today. And it is still, by any honest measure, a country inside a country. And if the Amish running their own economy in plain sight is already strange, wait until you see what 40,000 Hasidic Jews built in Orange County, New York. Because that one isn't quiet. That one rewrote the law. Number 9. Kiryas Joel, New York. The Kingdom in Orange County. About 50 miles northwest of Manhattan, in a patch of woods in Orange County, New York, there is a village called Kiryas Joel. It was founded in 1977 by a Hasidic rabbi named Joel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe, who wanted to move his most devout followers out of Brooklyn and into a place where they could live without distraction from the outside world. That is the official story. The real story is more interesting and much harder to explain to anyone who hasn't seen it in person. Kiryas Joel today has a population of around 35,000 people. Almost 100% of them are Hasidic Jews of the Satmar sect. The first language is Yiddish, not Hebrew, Yiddish. English is a second language, learned as you would learn French in a high school classroom. The men wear black coats and black hats. The women wear wigs and long skirts. There are effectively no cars driven by women. There are effectively no televisions. There is no public library in the secular sense. The signs are in Yiddish or Hebrew. The stores are closed on Saturday. The businesses close early on Friday afternoon. And the median age in Kiryas Joel is around 13 years old. 13. That is not a typo. The youngest median age of any community of that size in the United States. Here is the part that blew my mind when I first started digging into this place. Kiryas Joel officially is one of the poorest communities in the United States by median household income. Government figures have put around 70 to 80% of its residents below the federal poverty line. And yet, around 93% of Kiryas Joel homes are owner-occupied. 93. In a country where the national homeownership rate hovers around 65%, and in a county where the average starter home sells for prices that would choke a Brooklyn lawyer. How does a town full of officially poor people own almost all of its own homes? The answer is the same one we saw in Lancaster, but turned up to 11. Community capital, families pool, congregations underwrite. The outside accounting system, the W-2, the 1099, the tax return, does not capture how wealth actually flows inside Kiryas Joel. On paper, it looks like a poverty ward. On the ground, it looks like a functioning, tightly bonded, self-financing city-state. A woman I will call Sarah Levine, who grew up Hasidic in Williamsburg and left the community in her 20s, told me something I want you to hear very carefully. She said, "When you live there, the United States is like the weather. It is outside, it affects you, but it is not your real government. Your real government is the Rebbe and the committee. You don't call 911 for a domestic problem, you call the VARD, the committee. They decide, and 99% of the time, the police never hear about it." Picture this. You drive up Route 208 out of Monroe. You come around a bend. Suddenly, every building you see is the same beige. Every sidewalk is full of men in identical black coats. Every window has the same kind of lace curtain. There are no billboards. There are no chain restaurants. There is a single bank branch that posts its hours in Yiddish. A bus pulls up, a private bus, owned by the community, and unloads 50 schoolboys in white shirts and payas, who go streaming down the sidewalk in perfect coordination. A police car drives past. It is a New York State vehicle. The officer behind the wheel does not stop. He knows better than to stop. Kiryas Joel has its own internal enforcement, its own schools, its own ambulance corps called Hatsula, and its own way of handling problems. The state shows up to write a ticket occasionally. The state does not show up to run the town. And here is the part you will not read on Wikipedia. In 1989, Kiryas Joel got its own public school district. Its own. Created by a special act of the New York State Legislature. The Supreme Court of the United States eventually struck down the original version in 1994. So the New York Legislature passed another version, and another, and another. 3 times they rewrote the law until they had a version that would stick. A single town outside Manhattan successfully pushed state legislators to carve out a dedicated school district for its own religious community. 3 times. Because when you have 35,000 people who all vote the same way, in a state where the 2 parties are always 1 county away from each other in the Electoral College, you are not a voting bloc, you are a kingmaker. So when I tell you that Kiryas Joel is a country inside a country, I am not being poetic. I mean that the village has its own language, its own economy, its own schools, its own emergency services, its own internal courts in the form of rabbinical tribunals, and enough political leverage to reshape New York state law. The only thing it shares with the rest of us is the zip code. And the amazing thing is, most people driving north on the New York State Thruway have no idea they are passing it. But at least in Kiryas Joel, the residents asked the state for help. In our next town, the residents told the state to stay away, and the state listened. Number 8. Colorado City, Arizona. The border nobody crosses. Way down in the bottom corner of Utah, where it scrapes against the top of Arizona, there is a high desert town called Colorado City. It sits on a plateau of red rock and scrub at the base of cliffs that look like somebody took a knife and carved the state line out of the landscape. The nearest interstate is more than an hour away. The nearest large town is over an hour away. The nearest grocery store that the town itself does not own is over an hour away. And for most of the 20th century, if you were not born in Colorado City, you did not go to Colorado City. Not because a sign told you not to, because the town itself made sure you understood, within 10 minutes of crossing its limit, that you were not welcome. Colorado City is the twin of another town called Hilldale, just across the state line in Utah. We will talk about Hilldale separately. For now, focus on Colorado City. And understand that Colorado City, for almost the entire 20th century, was the administrative capital of a polygamist religious movement called the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The FLDS, a breakaway sect from mainstream Mormonism that never stopped practicing plural marriage after the mainstream church abandoned it in 1890. Here is the part that gets people to watch their step. For decades, Colorado City was not just a town where FLDS members lived. It was a town where the FLDS Church owned almost all of the land, through a trust called the United Effort Plan. The houses were assigned by the prophet of the church. The jobs were controlled by businesses owned by the faithful. The police department was staffed by FLDS members. The marshals, the elected town council, the water board, all of it. If you were FLDS, Colorado City was your whole world. If you were not, Colorado City was a place you drove through quickly, with the windows up, because the people on the sidewalks were not going to wave. I talked to a man I will call Russell Whitmore, who grew up in Colorado City and left at 17. He said something that I've been chewing on ever since. He said, "Report, state, when people talk about Colorado City, they talk about the marriages, the polygamy, the teenage girls. That is the headline. But the real story is the money and the houses. My father lost his house because he asked the wrong question. One Sunday, he was told his family would be reassigned. By Wednesday, another family had moved into his home, and he was told to sleep in his truck. The state did nothing, because the house wasn't his. It belonged to the trust, and the trust was the church, and the church was the town. Let that settle for a minute. A functioning American town inside the United States, where until well into the 2000s, your house was not legally yours. It was assigned to you by the church. If the church reassigned it, you moved. If you left the church, you lost the house. There was no private property in the way most Americans understand private property. There was only placement. Picture this. It is a Sunday morning in August. The temperature is already climbing past 90. You turn off Highway 389 and you roll into Colorado City. The first thing you notice is the houses. They are huge. Not mansions, not tasteful. Huge. 3 stories, sometimes 4, with additions bolted onto additions. Unpainted plywood on the newer wings, windows that do not match from floor to floor. They are big because they were built to hold plural families. 1 husband, 3 or 4 wives, 20 or 30 children. You do not build a house like that for a nuclear family. You build it for a dynasty. The second thing you notice is the quiet. Nobody is on the street, not because the town is empty, because they saw your car coming. Curtains shift, a door closes, a pickup truck rolls past you slowly, and the driver, a man in long sleeves and a long beard, does not turn his head as he passes. He has looked at you already, in the rear view. He already knows you are not from here. You drive past the co-op grocery store, which the church used to own outright. You drive past the meeting house. You drive past a cemetery where the headstones repeat the same 4 or 5 surnames over and over again. Barlow, Jessup, Jeffs, Steed, Allred. You drive past a playground where 30 children are playing in identical prairie dresses and handmade shirts, and not a single one of them waves. The third thing you notice, if you are paying attention, is the absence. No fast food, no gas station chain, no bank branches, no national pharmacy. No McDonald's, no Walgreens, no hotel, no Airbnb, no tourist anything. Because for almost 100 years, nobody was supposed to want to come to Colorado City. And nobody did, except the people who were born there, and the federal investigators who eventually started showing up with warrants. The whole system finally cracked open in 2006 when the prophet, a man named Warren Jeffs, was arrested in Nevada. He was convicted in Texas of sexual assault of a child. He is serving life plus 20 years. And after his arrest, the federal government and the state of Utah moved to take over the United Effort Plan Trust that owned all the land. It took years, it took lawyers, it took court orders, and it was fought block by block because the trust owned everything and the trust was the town. Today, Colorado City is changing. Some houses have been sold to non-FLDS buyers. Some new businesses have opened. Some of the faithful have scattered to smaller compounds in Texas, in South Dakota, in Nevada. Some stayed and are quietly trying to rebuild. But walk through Colorado City now and tell me with a straight face that it operates under the same rules as Flagstaff, 2 hours south. It does not. It is a town that tried to be a country. For 3 generations, it succeeded. The state of Arizona, on paper, was in charge the whole time. In practice, the state of Arizona did not set foot in Colorado City except to pave a road, for about 70 years. And here is the part that still keeps me up at night. It worked for that long because nobody outside noticed. Nobody wanted to notice. A town of a few thousand people out in the desert, doing whatever it was doing, as long as it did not spill across the state line. That is how you get a country inside a country. Not by secession, by distance. By a state government deciding, quietly, that some zip codes are not worth the trouble. If Colorado City built a country by hiding from the government, our next town tried the opposite. It tried to get rid of the government on purpose, and the result was not what anyone expected. Number 7. Grafton, New Hampshire. The Libertarian Experiment. Grafton is a small town in west-central New Hampshire. About 1,100 people, give or take. Pine woods, dirt roads, a town hall older than most American cities. For most of its history, Grafton was exactly what you would imagine if I said, quote 4, quiet, stubborn, tax allergic. The kind of place where the town meeting lasts 4 hours because everyone wants to argue about the price of gravel. Then, starting around 2004, something happened that put Grafton in every political science textbook for the next 20 years. A group of libertarian activists chose Grafton as the target of something called the Free Town Project. The idea was simple. Move enough committed libertarians into one small town, take over the town government through the normal democratic process, and then dismantle as much of local government as legally possible. No zoning, minimal taxes, minimal services. A functioning American town where the state, in practice, did almost nothing. In theory, beautiful. In practice, strange. And then, eventually, dangerous. Here is what actually happened. Starting in the mid-2000s, dozens, then hundreds of libertarians moved to Grafton. Some bought houses, some bought land and built cabins. Some lived in trailers, in tents, in structures that were not, strictly speaking, buildings. They ran for office. They won seats. They voted down the town budget. They cut the road budget. They cut the fire department. They cut the police budget to the point where the town, for years, was covered by a part-time sheriff who showed up when he could. They stopped funding the town library. They stopped, mostly, enforcing building codes. And for a while, Grafton functioned, barely. Taxes stayed low. People mostly got along. The experiment, on its own terms, was working. Then came the bears. I am not making this up. If you want the whole story, read the book called __, quote, _5__ by Matthew Hongoltz Hetling, which is one of the funniest and most alarming pieces of non-fiction written about New England in the past 20 years. Here is the short version. When a town stops enforcing garbage ordinances, when a town lets people leave food scraps in open compost, when a town has no money for animal control, when a town has residents who believe feeding wild animals is a personal right, the bears notice. And the bears come down out of the hills. And the bears stay. Grafton, by the late 2010s, had a bear problem like no other town in New Hampshire. Bears coming onto porches, bears breaking into sheds, bears attacking livestock, eventually bears hurting people. In 2012, a woman in nearby Benton was killed by a bear. In Grafton itself, attacks on pets and livestock became routine. Residents, libertarians and locals alike, started carrying firearms on their own property, not for protection from people, but for protection from bears. And the underlying cause was not the bears. The underlying cause was that nobody was in charge. Nobody was coordinating. Nobody was paying for the services that, in a normal American town, keep wild animals and human animals in their proper zones. A man I will call Dennis Whitfield, a long-time Grafton resident who was there before the libertarians arrived and is still there now, told me something I want you to remember. He said, Oat 6. Picture this. It is late October. You drive up a dirt road off Route 4 in Grafton. The woods are closing in. The leaves are already off the trees. You pass a trailer with solar panels on the roof and a hand-painted sign that reads, quote, 7. You pass a clearing with 3 cabins and a fire pit. A man waves at you from a porch. He has a rifle leaning against the railing, not in a threatening way, in a weather way, the way you might lean a broom. The next house is a normal New England farmhouse from 1860. The people inside it have been there for 4 generations. They have a neighbor now who believes most forms of government are theft. They get along most of the time. They both have bear stories. They both have opinions about the library. They vote against each other at the town meeting. They nod when they pass each other on the road. Grafton is not a country inside a country the way Colorado City was. It is something stranger. It is an American town where, for about 15 years, a serious political experiment was run on what happens when you cut the state out of daily life. The answer turned out to be complicated. Some services improved because volunteers stepped up. Some services collapsed because volunteers got tired. Property values stagnated. New residents arrived with very specific ideas about what freedom means. Old residents, many of whom had lived there for generations, learned to live next to them. The bears ate whoever was not paying attention. And the reason Grafton matters for our list is this. It is the American town that most openly, most publicly, tried to become a country inside a country. Not by religion, not by hiding, not by trust funds and profits, by principle, by vote, by a deliberate, documented attempt to shrink the government inside one town line. And it is still going. The experiment is not over. It just looks different now. Fewer bears, a little more infrastructure. A lot of lessons the rest of the country has not yet absorbed. Grafton tried to shrink the state. Our next town tried to build a mirror of the state, with the same buildings, the same street grid, the same everything, and then sealed the door behind it. Number 6, Hilldale, Utah, the mirror town. I said earlier we would come back to Hilldale. Here we are. Hilldale is the twin of Colorado City, sitting directly across the Utah state line, just north of its Arizona sibling. Same plateau, same red cliffs, same FLDS history, same prophet, Warren Jeffs, who held sway over both towns as if the state line were a cartoon joke. And in many ways, Hilldale is the same story as Colorado City. But I am listing it separately because Hilldale did something that Colorado City did not quite do, and it is worth stopping for a minute to see it. Hilldale, until the mid-2010s, had a secret second town inside it. Almost literally. The faithful lived in the houses everyone could see from the road. But there were compound houses tucked into the back lots, behind fences, behind other buildings, accessible only through certain paths. There were internal addresses that did not appear on any official map. There was an internal economy. When federal investigators and state investigators finally gained access after Jeffs' conviction, they found record-keeping systems that tracked marriages and reassignments and placements down to the household, run entirely inside the church. Not by the state, by the church. I am going to keep this one shorter because the mechanics are similar to Colorado City, and I want to save your attention for what is coming. But there is one detail from Hilldale I want you to carry with you. In 2017, Donia Jessup was elected the first non-FLDS mayor of Hilldale. Let me repeat that. The first. In the history of the town. 2017. That is not ancient history. That is the year the iPhone X came out. That is 7 years before this video. For the entire modern history of Hilldale, until Donia Jessup stood up, the town was run by the church, for the church, through officials chosen or approved by the prophet. The state of Utah certified the elections. The state of Utah did not interfere with how they worked. Donia Jessup was herself raised FLDS. She left the church. She came back to Hilldale as an outsider, ran and won. She told reporters afterward that on her first day, she walked into the town offices and found that the previous administration had taken almost everything with them. Computers, files, keys, supplies. The town she was elected to lead had, in a very literal sense, been gutted by the people who were supposed to hand it to her. That is what a country inside a country looks like when it loses. It does not surrender. It walks out, carrying the filing cabinets. Hilldale today is one of the most interesting slow-motion transitions in the United States. It is being reintegrated very slowly into the normal Utah municipal system. Non-FLDS families are moving in. Some of the compound houses are being subdivided and sold. There is a new kind of normalcy taking root, and it is not yet clear what it will look like when it is finished. Keep that word in your head, transition, because the next town on our list did not get a transition. It got an ending. Number 5, Leith, North Dakota, the town they tried to buy. In 2012, a white supremacist named Craig Cobb started buying land in a tiny town in Grant County, North Dakota. Population of Leith at the time, about 20 people. Not 200, not 2,000, 20. Cobb's plan, announced publicly, was to buy enough land in Leith to give ownership plots to like-minded white nationalists. If enough of them moved in, they could dominate a town election. They could elect a mayor. They could elect a council. They could rename the town, fly whatever flags they wanted, and, in Cobb's own words, create a white nationalist enclave inside the United States. This is where you learn that the machinery that allowed Kiryas Joel to happen, and Colorado City to happen, and Grafton to happen, is neutral. The machinery does not care who uses it. An American town is, legally speaking, just a set of voters and a set of offices. If you can buy enough land, move enough sympathetic voters in, and win an election, the town is yours. That is how local democracy works, everywhere, in all 50 states. Cobb got close. He moved in. A few of his supporters moved in. They started flying Nazi and white supremacist flags on their lots. They walked through town with rifles. They filmed themselves confronting the existing residents. The existing residents, mostly elderly, mostly farming families who had lived in Leith for generations, were terrified. One couple in town was interracial. Cobb's people made a point of telling them they were the target. Here is what saved Leith, and here is the part that is very important for understanding this whole video. The state of North Dakota did not save Leith by sending in troops. The federal government did not save Leith by sending in agents. What saved Leith was that the remaining residents, all 20 of them, went to war. Not with guns, with paperwork. They worked with the county. They worked with public health officials. They passed local ordinances requiring working sewage systems, working water connections, occupancy permits, minimum habitation standards. Exactly the kind of small-town code enforcement that libertarians in Grafton had been voting against for years. And those rules, applied fairly and uniformly to every property, made it impossible for Cobb's movement to live in the shacks and trailers they had planned to use as their foothold. Cobb himself ran into legal trouble for waving firearms at neighbors and was eventually arrested. His co-conspirators scattered. The flags came down. By 2015, the experiment was over. Leith survived. A woman I will call Mary Gerving, who was one of the holdouts in Leith during the standoff, said something I think about all the time. She said, "We figured out really fast that the state of North Dakota was not going to save us. Nobody was going to save us. We had to save ourselves with whatever tools the state had already given us. And it turned out the most powerful tool in a small town is the building code. Leith is on this list not because it succeeded in becoming a country inside a country. It is on this list because it almost did. Because 20 people in North Dakota, for about 3 years, stood on a knife edge between remaining an ordinary American town and becoming a white nationalist enclave. And the line that held was not a federal line. It was a county sewage ordinance. Remember that the next time somebody tells you that small-town regulations are a waste of time. From a town that fought off its invaders, we go to a town that invited its residents in, built a utopia, and then accidentally invented the silverware in your grandmother's drawer. Number 4. Oneida, New York. The commune that sold silverware. In 1848, in upstate New York, not far from Syracuse, a man named John Humphrey Noyes founded a religious community called the Oneida Community. It was one of hundreds of utopian communes that sprang up in 19th century America. Most of them died within a few years. Oneida did not. Oneida lasted for more than 30 years as a functioning, radical, self-governing society that rejected almost every premise of mainstream American life. Here is what the Oneida community actually did. They practiced something called complex marriage, which meant that every adult member of the community was, in a religious sense, married to every other adult member. No monogamous pairings, no private families. Children were raised communally after they were weaned. Property was held in common. Work was rotated. Decisions were made collectively under the guidance of noise. Sexual relationships were regulated through a system of spiritual mentorship that by modern standards ranged from unusual to alarming. The community at its peak had about 300 members. They built a massive brick mansion house, most of which still stands today and can be toured. They ran farms, a silk mill, a trap factory, and eventually a silverware business. You know where this is going. When the Oneida community dissolved in 1881 under external legal and moral pressure, it reorganized itself as a joint stock company. The company took its name from the town. The company became one of the largest silverware manufacturers in the United States for the next century. Oneida Limited. If you have flatware in a drawer in your kitchen that says Oneida on the back, it comes directly from an American religious commune that practiced complex marriage in upstate New York during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Oneida is on this list because, for 33 years, it was a functioning country inside a country. Its members did not follow American norms about marriage. They did not follow American norms about property. They did not follow American norms about child rearing. They did not follow American norms about labor or income. They built their own schools, their own internal governance, their own economy, and they did it in plain sight, in a brick mansion on a hill, for 3 decades. While the United States carried on around them. And here is the part that I find the most American of all. When the outside pressure finally got too strong, the Oneida community did not fight. They did not flee into the hills. They did not go underground. They reorganized into a corporation and kept the money. The religion died. The commune died. The silverware business lived. And most of the descendants of the original Oneida community today are ordinary upstate New Yorkers who happen to share a last name and a strange inheritance. There is a lesson in that. A country inside a country does not always die when it loses its theology. Sometimes it becomes a brand. Our next town also imported its customs from abroad, but it did not blend in. It did not evolve. It simply kept going, deep in the mountains, speaking a language the rest of the state did not speak. Number 3. Rugby, Tennessee, the English colony in Appalachia. In 1880, a British author named Thomas Hughes, famous for writing the novel ___9___, founded a colony on the Cumberland Plateau in eastern Tennessee. He called it Rugby, after the English school. His idea was to bring young English gentlemen of the second son class, the ones who would not inherit their family estates under English primogeniture law, to America. In Rugby, they could build a life on the frontier without having to do anything that, in his words, would compromise their status as gentlemen. They would farm, they would read, they would play cricket, they would attend services at Christ Church Episcopal, and they would build, in the middle of Appalachia, a small piece of Victorian England. Let that sit with you for a moment. In the middle of the Cumberland Plateau in the 1880s, surrounded by hard-scrabble Tennessee farmers and coal towns and revival tent preachers, there was a colony of young Englishmen in tweed playing cricket. It almost worked. For a few years. They built a library, they built a church, they built Victorian-style cottages, some of which still stand today, preserved as one of the best collections of Victorian architecture in the southern United States. They published a newspaper. They ran farms. They welcomed visitors from England and from the American cities of the Atlantic coast. Rugby, for a moment in the 1880s, was one of the strangest and most specific places in the United States. Then came reality. The young gentlemen were not very good farmers because they had never farmed. A typhoid outbreak killed a number of residents. The English backers got cold feet. Hughes himself spent his own money trying to keep the colony alive and eventually gave up. By the 1890s, Rugby was shrinking. By the early 20th century, it was almost a ghost town. Not abandoned exactly, but quiet. Families lived there. Services at the church continued. The library stayed open, and the buildings, remarkably, survived. Today, Rugby has a population of a few dozen people in the historic district. It is preserved as a historic site. You can visit the library, where thousands of Victorian-era books are still on the shelves. You can sit in the church, which is still used. You can walk down the dirt roads and see cottages that look like they belong in Warwickshire, with pastures that look like they belong in Tennessee, and a silence that belongs to neither. It is one of the most unusual preserved communities in the eastern United States, and almost no one outside of Tennessee has heard of it. I visited Rugby a few years ago. I sat in the library on a Tuesday afternoon. The light came through the windows in a way that felt, somehow, imported. Like the library itself had carried a piece of England with it across the Atlantic and refused to let it go. A woman behind the desk, who had lived in Rugby most of her life, told me something I want you to hear. She said, quote, "Rugby is a country inside a country that did not fight. It did not hide. It did not grow. It just insisted, quietly, on being itself. And when the economics of the colony failed, the culture of the colony stayed. It is the gentlest kind of enclave, and it is still there. Our next town is even quieter. It has one road, it has one store, and most of the conversations you will hear there are not in English. They are in a dialect of Russian that almost no one in Russia still speaks." Number 2. Nikolaevsk, Alaska. Old Believers on the Kenai. Drive south out of Anchorage for about 4 hours, cross the Kenai Peninsula, turn off the main highway onto a gravel road that does not look like it leads anywhere important. Follow it for a few miles. You will arrive at a village called Nikolaevsk. Population, depending on the year and who is counting, somewhere between 200 and 300 people. Founded in 1968. Almost every resident is a descendant of a religious group called the Russian Old Believers. Here is who the Old Believers are. In 1666, the Russian Orthodox Church undertook a set of liturgical reforms. A large group of Russian Christians refused to accept those reforms. They became known as the Old Believers. They were persecuted by the Russian state for centuries. Some were executed, some were exiled. Some fled east into Siberia. Some fled farther east into China. Some fled from China into South America, into Brazil, into Argentina. And in the 1960s, a group of Old Believer families made their way from Brazil through Oregon into Alaska, where they founded Nikolaevsk on the Kenai Peninsula. Think about that migration for a second. Russia to Siberia, to China, to Brazil, to Oregon, to Alaska. 300 years of flight because of a disagreement in 1666 about how many fingers you use to cross yourself. In Nikolaevsk today, the first language is Russian, a specific archaic dialect of Russian, closer in some ways to the Russian spoken in the 17th century than to the Russian spoken in Moscow today. The men wear traditional embroidered shirts called rubashkas. The women wear long dresses and headscarves. Meals are eaten with specific utensils that outsiders do not share. There is a church in the village with onion domes painted bright blue. Services are conducted in Old Church Slavonic. The community has its own fishing fleet, its own school traditions, its own marriage customs, its own internal rules about who can enter the sanctuary and how. And this is inside the United States, in Alaska, under the American flag, under the laws of the state of Alaska. But functionally, culturally, linguistically, religiously, Nikolaevsk is a piece of 17th century Russia preserved by refrigeration in amber. on a gravel road in Alaska. I spoke with a linguist, a man I will call Dr. Peter Ivanov, who studies the Russian spoken in Alaska's Old Believer communities. He told me something that stopped me cold. He said, "Report state the Russian you hear in Nikolaevsk is not broken Russian. It is not kitchen Russian. It is a living form of a dialect that is essentially extinct in its homeland. These people did not lose their language, they carried it, across 4 continents, for 350 years. A philologist in Moscow would pay to sit where you are sitting right now. Picture this. It is a Saturday evening in September. You drive into Nikolaevsk as the light is dying. You pass a small sign at the edge of the village, hand-painted in Cyrillic. You pass wooden houses with carved window frames, the kind you would expect in a village outside Nizhny Novgorod, not outside Homer. You pass a man walking home from the docks in high rubber boots, with a beard down to his chest, and he nods at you. Not unfriendly, not friendly, just a nod. The smell of fish and wood smoke in the air. A child runs past you, yelling something in a Russian that a modern Russian speaker would understand only halfway. A woman is beating a rug on a porch railing. You reach the center of the village. The church stands there. Small, wooden, blue domes, crossbars at angles you have never seen on any American church. Services tomorrow will last 4 hours, standing, in Old Church Slavonic, with candles, with icons, with a liturgy that was rejected by the Patriarch of Moscow in 1666 and never updated. Nikolaevsk is a country inside a country in the purest sense. Not because it wants to be, because it has been a country inside every country it has ever lived in. It was a country inside Russia. It was a country inside China. It was a country inside Brazil. It is, now, a country inside the United States. And when the next pressure comes, whatever it is, there is a reasonable chance that some of these families will pack up again and carry their dialect and their icons to whichever coast will have them. That is what 350 years of not compromising looks like. It looks like a gravel road on the Kenai Peninsula. And now we come to the strangest one. The one I put at number 1, not because it is the biggest, not because it is the most famous, but because it breaks a rule that Americans take for granted. It is the town that ate the state line. Number 1, Short Creek, the town that ate the line. Short Creek is not the official name of anything. Short Creek is the name people who grew up there use for the combined community of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. One street runs through both. One water system serves both. One power grid serves both. One church served both for most of the 20th century. One school district for decades straddled both. Families lived with their kitchen in one state and their bedrooms in another. Literally. Houses were built across the state line on purpose so that when law enforcement from one state came to investigate something, the person they were looking for could walk 10 feet into the other state and be in a different jurisdiction with a different prosecutor, a different governor, and a different set of priorities. Let me say that again because I want you to feel it. For most of the 20th century, in the United States of America, there was a town where you could commit an act in your kitchen, walk 10 feet into your living room, and be in a different state, under different laws, with different police. And the people who lived there built it that way on purpose. This is the boss level of what we are talking about today. Lancaster County has its own economy. Kiryas Joel has its own schools. Colorado City had its own trust. Hilldale had its own internal map. Grafton tried to vote the government out. Leith almost got invaded. Oneida became a silverware company. Rugby became a museum. Nikolaevsk carried a dialect across 4 continents. All of those are strange. All of those are real. But Short Creek is the one that took the single hardest thing a country has, its border, and turned it into a tool. Here is how it worked in practice. A man who was the patriarch of a plural family in Short Creek could hold property on the Utah side in the name of one wife, property on the Arizona side in the name of another, and run his business through a trust based in Nevada. If Utah launched an investigation, the Arizona houses were out of reach. If Arizona launched an investigation, the Utah houses were out of reach. If federal agents got involved, the trust had to be unwound in federal court, which takes years, sometimes decades. And during those years, children grew up, marriages were performed, money moved, and the pattern continued. In 1953, the state of Arizona attempted what came to be known as the Short Creek Raid. Arizona State Police, acting on orders from the governor, entered Colorado City with the intent of breaking up the plural marriage system. They arrested the men. They took the children into state custody. They announced the operation to the press. It was supposed to be a triumph of law enforcement. It was a catastrophe, politically, morally, strategically. Photographs of crying mothers and confused children separated from their fathers ran in newspapers across the country. The Arizona governor who ordered the raid, Howard Pyle, was destroyed politically. He lost his next election, and every state and federal official who looked at Short Creek for the next 50 years remembered what had happened to Pyle and decided, quietly, that Short Creek was not worth the trouble. That is the mechanism. A country inside a country is not held together only by walls or by theology. Sometimes it is held together by the memory of what happened the last time somebody tried to enforce the normal rules. Short Creek was left alone for half a century, not because it was impossible to enforce the law there, but because the last politician who tried had his career ended on national television, and every politician after him did the math. I talked to a woman I will call Elaine Barlow, who was born in Short Creek and left in her 30s. She said something I cannot shake. She said, "Reports state, when outsiders ask me how we got away with it for so long, I tell them a very simple thing. The state line was not a problem. The state line was the whole business model. Everything we did was built on the fact that nobody could chase us across it. Not easily, not cheaply, not without making the news. We weren't hiding in the desert. We were hiding in the paperwork." Hiding in the paperwork. Write that phrase down. That is how a country inside a country actually operates in 21st century America. Not behind walls, not behind guns. Behind trusts, behind jurisdiction lines, behind the simple refusal of any single authority to take full responsibility for what is happening inside a zip code that is, technically, somebody else's problem. Picture this. It is a Thursday afternoon in June. You drive up Central Street in Short Creek. The street runs north and south. On the east side of the street, you are in Colorado City, Arizona. On the west side of the street, you are in Hilldale, Utah. There is no sign. There is no marker on the pavement. You could stand with one foot in each state, and you would not know it unless somebody told you. A mother crosses the street with her children. She has just walked from one state to another. A delivery truck rolls past. Its driver does not think about which state he is in. He thinks about the address. A police car drives past, and you notice, if you are paying attention, that it says ___, quote, _13, ___, on the side. In 2017, a federal judge stripped that marshal's office of its law enforcement authority, finding that it had functioned for decades as an arm of the FLDS Church rather than as a neutral police force. Think about that. A federal court looked at an American town's police department and concluded on the record that it was not really a police department. It was something else wearing a police department's uniform. That is Short Creek, a town where the street is the border, the houses cross the border, the families cross the border, the money crosses the border, and the border itself, That line that on every map of the United States looks like a hard, clean piece of geometry turned out, in practice, to be a door. And if you know how to open it, you live on one side of the law in the morning and the other side of the law by dinner. This is why Short Creek is number one. Not because it is the most picturesque, not because it has the highest population, not because it is the most religious, or the richest, or the strangest, because it is the town that most clearly, most cynically, most effectively demonstrated the truth that all 10 of these towns are pointing at from different angles. The truth that most Americans do not want to hear. The United States of America, on paper, is a single country. 50 states, one flag, one constitution. But the United States of America, on the ground, is a quilt of jurisdictions, each of them run by people with their own priorities, their own politics, their own fears, their own political memories. And in the seams of that quilt, in the places where one state's attention ends and another state's begins, in the places where one county sheriff decides not to drive up a certain road, in the places where one governor remembers what happened to the last governor who tried something, there is room for entire other countries to exist, quietly, legally, for generations. 10 today. There are more. I could have made this list 30 towns long. I picked these 10 because each one shows a different mechanism. Religion, economy, migration, ideology, border geometry, paperwork, distance, silence, memory. All 10 are real. All 10 are still there, in some form, right now, as you are watching this video. And all 10 are inside, officially, on the map, the United States of America. Here is the question I promised you at the beginning, the one you will not want to answer out loud. If there are 10 towns like this, and I just walked you through them, how many more are there that neither of us know about? How many zip codes in this country, right now, are running on a set of rules that you have never heard of, under the authority of a person you have never heard of, in a language that is not the one on the signs? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Not the Census Bureau, not the FBI, not the governor of your state. Because a country inside a country, by definition, does not want to be counted. And in the seams of the American quilt, there is a lot of room not to be counted. The next time you drive through a small American town and something feels off, do not shake it off. Do not tell yourself you are imagining it. Ask yourself a very simple question. Who actually runs this place? Not on paper, on the ground. Who decides who lives in which house? Who decides which kids go to which school? Who decides what happens when somebody breaks a rule? If the answer is not immediately obvious, if the answer is not the mayor, or the sheriff, or the school board, then congratulations, you have just found one. You are standing in a country inside a country, and depending on who is running it, that might be the safest place you've ever been, or it might be the last place you want to spend the night. 10 currencies, 10 calendars, 10 sets of rules, and one flag above all of them. This is Report State. If you made it to the end of this one, you know why I asked you to subscribe. Next time, we are going to do something different. We are going to look at 10 states where the infrastructure, the roads, the water, the power grid is quietly collapsing, and nobody in Washington is coming to fix it. Which means, in 20 years, some of those states are going to start looking a lot like the towns we just walked through today. Not by choice, by abandonment. Watch that one when it drops, and until then, pay attention to the seams.